Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Our mission today, well, it cuts right to the heart of modern capitalism. We're looking at understanding the rapidly evolving ethical contract, the one that binds businesses to their two most critical groups.
Yeah, consumers and employees.
Exactly.
And we're not just, skimming the surface with market trends. We're tackling a whole stack of complex research here. We're linking generational shifts, labor history, consumer protection laws, even governance theory.
It's a lot to connect.
It is, and this whole deep dive, it's anchored on one really powerful theme, this relentless search for truth and for voice, and how that search is basically forcing a fundamental ethical and strategic overhaul of business globally.
Okay, so we've got sources covering the defining characteristics of Generation Z.
Right.
And also the major decades-long erosion of worker stability and rights. That's a big one.
Huge.
And then the urgent need for a new standard of ethical leadership to actually manage all this volatility.
And what's really fascinating here, I think, is that connection. We're directly linking how generations consume their preferences to these really long-term trends in labor and how companies are governed.
Yeah.
This isn't just tweaking a marketing campaign.
No, it sounds mega.
It demands a total structural rethink, a shift in mindset, really.
Absolutely. So how should we structure this? Maybe 3 parts?
Sounds good. We could start with a consumer evolution, really dig into Gen Z, this true gen, then pivot inward, look at the rights and treatment of the employee, the internal stakeholder.
Like loss of their voice.
Exactly. And finally ask, what kind of leadership can actually navigate this new, complex, stakeholder-driven reality?
Okay, let's do it. Part 1. The emergence of true gen and redefining consumption. Right, let's start with the external stakeholder, the consumer, specifically Generation Z.
Yeah.
Generally defined as born between, 1995 and 2010?
That's the usual bracket, yeah.
Yeah.
And our sources make it crystal clear. Their context is just radically different from any generation before.
How so?
Well, they're the first generation of true digital natives. I mean, they've grown up completely immersed in the internet, social networks, mobile systems, right from childhood.
It's just always been there for them.
Always. And this creates what the sources call a hypercognitive generation. Think about it. They're constantly collecting information, cross-referencing it, weaving together their virtual and offline lives seamlessly. They know how to find stuff out. It's ingrained.
And that seems to contrast pretty sharply with millennials, or Gen Y, right? The sources suggest millennials were maybe more idealistic, perhaps because they grew up in generally better economic times.
That's a key point. Millennials are often seen as more idealistic, maybe a bit more self-focused, confrontational even. Gen Z, though, gets labeled the true gen.
True gen. Why true?
Because their defining behaviors seem rooted in this intense search for truth and realism. Their context wasn't necessarily one of economic buoyancy. The sources mention things like Brazil's biggest downturn happening during their formative years.
So that economic stress breeds pragmatism.
Exactly, a profound sense of pragmatism. And this search for truth, it anchors 4 core behaviors that leaders really need to get their heads around.
Okay, let's break those down. What's the first one? Something about identity.
Yes, the first is undefined ID. They really value individual expression, and they actively push back against being boxed in, categorized, stereotyped.
So labels are out.
Pretty much. They see the self not as this fixed thing, but more like a space to experiment, to test things out, to change. The source calls them identity nomads.
Identity nomads, I like that. Any data backing this up?
Oh yeah, dramatic data.
Yeah.
20% of Gen Zers apparently don't consider themselves exclusively heterosexual. That's double the rate of previous generations. And they place huge importance on defending identity-related causes, human rights, race, ethnicity, LGBTQ+ issues, feminism.
Wow. Okay, so that fluidity and identity must shape how they connect with others, too.
It definitely informs the next trait, being communaholic.
Communaholic, so addicted to community.
Sort of, but it's how they form community that's different. Older generations might gravitate towards people with similar socioeconomic backgrounds, Gen Z, radically inclusive.
How does that work?
They flow constantly, almost without thinking, between online groups and physical ones. But the glue isn't shared wealth or status. It's shared causes and shared interests.
So it's what you care about, not what you earn.
Precisely. The research found 66% of Gen Zers believe communities are created by causes and interests. That's much higher than older groups. They're comfortable belonging to multiple spheres, online gaming groups, local volunteer initiatives, global activism networks, all at once.
Okay, undefined ID, communaholic. What's the third trait? You mentioned it might seem counterintuitive given their activist reputation.
Right. The third is dialoguer. They have this deep-seated belief in using dialogue to solve conflicts and improve the world.
Interesting. So less about tearing things down.
Well, here's where their pragmatism really comes through, compared to older generations. I think the stat was 57% of older folks feel change requires breaking with the system entirely. For Gen Z, that drops to 49%.
So nearly half still think that, but significantly fewer.
Exactly. They seem more willing to engage with institutions, even ones whose values they might partially reject. They'll try to extract what makes sense, work within the system for gradual change, rather than just rejecting the whole thing outright. They see dialogue as, well, a more realistic tool for lasting progress.
Pragmatism again, which leads us neatly to the final defining trait, doesn't it?
It does. The fourth is being realistic.
How does that play out?
Their constant access to information overload makes them incredibly analytical and, well, pragmatic about decisions. They just have too much data swirling around to be purely idealistic dreamers.
And the economic background factors in again.
Definitely. Witnessing instability, maybe their parents struggling, it makes them prioritize stability and control. And this leads to some maybe surprising preferences.
Like what?
Like favoring job stability over just chasing the highest possible salary, or actually preferring regular, steady employment over the freelance or part-time gig work we often associate with younger generations.
Huh. That pushes back on the narrative, doesn't it?
It really does. They're not all just chasing flexibility at any cost. They seem keenly aware of the need to save, to build a secure future. That realism is quite profound.
Okay, so if this hypercognitive, pragmatic, realistic generation is the true gen, how does all that translate into how they actually buy things? It sounds like it fundamentally redefines consumption.
Oh, absolutely. It challenges traditional business models at their core. The first major shift our sources highlight is this move from possession to access.
Right, the subscription economy idea.
Exactly, but broader. It's driven by that pragmatism and their desire for fluidity. Consumption becomes less about owning a thing and more about having access to what that thing does. Think streaming services, car sharing, software subscriptions.
So the value isn't in the physical car, it's in the mobility service.
Precisely. The source uses a great example. Instead of selling 1,000 cars, maybe you sell one car 1,000 times through a service model. Value is created by that unlimited access.
And this ties into the gig economy too, right?
It does. Consumers can leverage their relationship with these access-based companies, think ride-sharing drivers or Airbnb hosts, to generate income themselves. It blurs the line, between being a consumer and being a sort of micro-entrepreneur.
Okay, so access over possession. What's the second big implication for consumption?
Singularity. Consumption is an expression of individual identity. This flows directly from that undefined ID we talked about.
Because they're identity nomads.
Right. So consumption isn't about fitting in with a crowd. It's a primary means of self-expression. They crave personalized products, things that reflect their unique, maybe temporary identity.
And they'll pay for it.
The data suggests yes. A significant number, 58% of higher income Gen Z, 43% of middle income, said they'd pay a premium for offerings tailored just for them.
And we see their rejection of stereotypes here too.
Clearly. A really striking stat. 48% of Gen Z value brands that don't classify items as strictly male or female. That's compared to just 38% of older generations. They want things that aren't pre-boxed.
But there's a tension here, isn't there? Between wanting hyper-personalization and being wary of sharing data.
Ah, yes. The data paradox. It's a huge challenge for companies. Gen Z demands tailored experiences, but they fiercely guard their privacy.
How fiercely?
Well, the sources say only about 10 to 15% share their personal data easily. That number only creeps up to maybe 35%, and only if the company provides very clear, tangible value in return.
So give us your data so we can sell you more stuff isn't going to fly.
Not at all. They need a compelling what's in it for me. And companies have to get really innovative and, frankly, ethical about how they gather insights without being intrusive.
Okay, access singularity. What's the third and maybe most demanding implication?
The third is consumption anchored on ethics. This is where that search for truth really hits the entire business model, top to bottom.
They expect brands to take a stand.
Yes, but crucially, that stand needs to be relevant to the brand, authentic and demonstrable throughout the company's actions. It's not just a slogan.
And this leads to something called ethical convergence.
That's the term the source uses, and it's profound. Younger consumers, especially Gen Z, simply make no distinction between the ethics of the brand itself, the ethics of its parent company, and the ethics of its partners and suppliers.
Wow. So if your supplier uses unethical labor practices, even if your brand markets itself as ethical.
The whole thing is tainted in their eyes. It's a holistic view. Ethics isn't just a marketing department issue anymore. It's a massive supply chain and corporate governance vulnerability.
Because they'll find out that hypercognitive ability.
They will. If a brand advertises diversity but its leadership or supply chain lacks it, Gen Z knows how to use their digital skills to uncover that contradiction quickly.
And they hold grudges.
The data says yes. 80% of all respondents in one study remembered a company scandal and actively refused to buy from those companies afterward. That scrutiny changes everything.
Even down to things like influencer marketing.
Absolutely. They're searching for authenticity. They know the big mega influencers are often heavily subsidized, maybe less genuine. So they pay more attention to smaller, closer connections, micro-influencers, maybe people with 5,000 to 20,000 followers, where the relationship feels more real. Hashtag 1.3, connecting Gen Z to historical consumer roles.
It's fascinating, but it's important to remember, like you said, they didn't invent activism. They just digitized it, maybe amplified it. Their behaviors seem to fit into historical patterns of consumer roles, don't they?
They really do. It's a useful framework. Their strong emphasis on singularity, using consumption for self-expression. That makes them powerful communicators of identity and values through their choices.
And their hypercognitive nature, always researching, comparing.
That makes them the ultimate explorers of information, experiences, and alternatives. They're constantly evaluating.
And finally, that demand for ethical alignment, the willingness to boycott or call out bad practices.
That connects them directly to the historical roles of the activist and the rebel. Think boycotts, anti-consumption movements, culture jamming. Gen Z wields these tactics with digital speed and reach.
Is that willingness to rebel measurable?
Oh, yes. The sources show they are highly willing to stop buying and, crucially, spread the word online about companies whose campaigns they see as offensive. Like 81% react strongly against campaigns perceived as macho.
81%.
Yeah, and 79% against racist ones, 76% against homophobic ones. The power of the digitally connected consumer activist, well, companies ignore it at their peril. It's a real force.
Okay, so that digital activism, that demand for truth and accountability from Gen Z, it's got the modern edge of a much longer story, right? The whole idea of consumer protection, it didn't appear overnight.
Not at all. It has a rich history. Which brings us nicely to part 2, looking at how society has tried to balance the power between buyer and seller. Hashtag 2.1. The history and rights of the consumer movement. The consumer movement, particularly in the U.S., really gained traction in waves. The first significant one was back in the 1910s during the Progressive era.
What was the driving idea then?
It was the first real pushback against the old doctrine of caveat emptor.
Buyer beware.
Exactly. The idea started to shift, suggesting maybe the seller had some responsibility for safety and quality, not just the buyer needing to be careful. Then we saw another wave during the New Deal in the 1930s.
But the 1960s seems to be when it really took off politically.
Definitely. That was fueled by broader social change movements. People were questioning all sorts of power structures, and the marketplace was one of them.
What specifically made organized consumer protection feel so necessary then? Why couldn't buyer beware hold up anymore?
Well, the sources point to 4 main drivers that basically eroded caveat emptor. First, products just got way more complex. Think appliances, electronics.
Right, not simple tools anymore.
Second, they became highly specialized. The average person couldn't easily judge the quality or safety of what was inside. Third, advertising exploded. And sometimes it relied more on, let's say, emotional appeals or inflated claims than hard facts.
And the fourth.
And maybe the most critical. Some businesses were demonstrably ignoring product safety, cutting corners, basically, in the pursuit of profit, leading to injuries and harm.
And this growing awareness led to a landmark moment, right? JFK's speech in 1962?
Yes, President Kennedy's landmark speech where he outlined the foundational 4 basic rights of the consumer. These became the bedrock of the movement.
Can you remind us what those were?
Sure. The right to safety protection against hazardous goods, the right to be informed protection against fraudulent or misleading information, advertising, labeling, the right to choose access to a variety of products and services at competitive prices, and the right to be heard, assurance that consumer interests will receive full and sympathetic consideration in government policy.
And didn't later thinking add a couple more?
It did. Our sources note the later additions of the right to service, meaning fair treatment and remedy from businesses, which gained traction post-civil rights movement. And, critically for our discussion today, the right to privacy.
Which is huge now. So the government responded to these calls in the 60s and 70s.
Oh yeah, with a real flurry of regulatory activism.
Yeah.
New laws were passed, new federal agencies were created, existing ones were strengthened. It was a major period of government intervention on behalf of the consumer.
But that didn't last forever.
No, the pendulum swung back a bit in the 1980s towards deregulation at the federal level. Interestingly, though, state governments often stepped into that gap and became more active in consumer protection. Then, the 90s and 2000s saw a revival of federal activism again.
Driven by what overarching goals? What were these laws trying to achieve?
Broadly, 5 things. Provide better purchase information so consumers can make informed choices. Protect consumers against hazards to their health and safety. Promote competitive pricing. Promote consumer choice. And increasingly protect consumer privacy, especially online. Hashtag 2.2 key agencies and regulatory challenges.
Okay, so to manage all these goals, there's a pretty big regulatory infrastructure in place. Could you highlight maybe the key federal agencies we should know about, especially those dealing with the kinds of ethical and privacy concerns relevant to Gen Z?
Sure. Probably the most significant overall is the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC. They're the generalist, dealing with deceptive advertising, unfair business practices, packaging, labeling, consumer credit, and crucially, they're the main agency tackling online privacy and data security.
Okay, FTC is the big one. Who else?
Then you have the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. Their focus is narrower but vital. Safety, effectiveness, and labeling of food, drugs, cosmetics, and medical devices. For safety related to physical products, things that could catch fire or injure you, there's the Consumer Product Safety Commission, CPSC. They set standards for things like toys or flammable fabrics.
And financial products, that's a big area of concern.
Absolutely. That's primarily handled by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB, which was created more recently after the financial crisis. Their job is to ensure fairness and transparency in mortgages, credit cards, and other financial services.
Got it. So focusing on privacy for a moment, given that Gen Z data paradox we discussed, wanting personalization but hating data sharing, how is consumer protection actually trying to handle this massive challenge in the internet age?
It's really a three-pronged approach, and there's constant tension between them. The first approach is basically consumer self-help.
Meaning it's up to me.
Essentially, yeah. You, the listener, using privacy settings, ad blockers, VPNs, being careful about what you share. That's the first line of defense.
Okay, what's the second?
Industry self-regulation. This is where businesses or industry groups create their own codes of conduct or technical standards for privacy. The argument for this is that they have the technological expertise and can adapt quickly.
But the criticism?
The criticism, consistently, is that these self-imposed rules might be too weak, too self-serving, and lack real enforcement teeth. Are they genuinely protecting consumers or just managing PR?
Which naturally leads to the third approach.
Privacy legislation. This means new, legally binding government regulations. This often happens when self-help and self-regulation are seen as failing to adequately protect consumers. Think of major laws like Europe's GDPR or state-level laws like the California Consumer Privacy Act. It's the most contentious approach, often involving big battles between industry and consumer advocates. Hashtag 2.3 product liability and business responses.
Beyond these agencies and specific laws, there's another really powerful legal concept protecting consumers, especially in the U.S. You mentioned it briefly. Strict liability. Can you unpack that a bit? It sounds important.
It is incredibly important. Strict liability, in the context of products, means that if a manufacturer makes a product that turns out to be defective and that defect causes injury, the manufacturer can be held responsible for the harm.
Even if the consumer can't prove the company was careless or negligent.
Exactly. That's the crucial part.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily have to prove negligence or that they breached a specific warranty. You primarily need to show the product was defective when it left the manufacturer's control, and that defect caused the injury during normal use. It puts a very heavy burden of safety directly onto the producer.
The famous example always cited here is the McDonald's hot coffee case, isn't it? Though, as you said, often misunderstood.
It's the classic, yeah. And it perfectly illustrates strict liability, despite the way it's often portrayed as frivolous. The reality wasn't just someone spilling coffee. It was that the coffee was served at a temperature far hotter than industry standards, hot enough to cause near instantaneous third-degree burns.
And McDonald's knew this was happening.
They had hundreds of prior burn claims. So under strict liability, the argument was that the product itself, coffee served at that specific dangerous temperature, was defective for its intended use. The initial large jury award, although later reduced, wasn't about that one spill. It reflected the finding that the product posed an unreasonable danger. It showed the power of holding producers strictly liable.
Okay, so given that kind of legal exposure, it's understandable that businesses would push back or seek reforms. You mentioned the Class Action Fairness Act of 2005, CFA, earlier. What was that trying to achieve?
CAFA was largely aimed at reining in large multi-state class action lawsuits, many of which involved product liability claims. Its main effect was moving most of these big cases from state courts into federal courts.
Why does that matter?
It aimed to prevent plaintiffs' lawyers from shopping for state courts perceived as being overly plaintiff-friendly or prone to granting massive awards. It also tried to change how lawyers in these cases were paid, tying their fees more closely to the actual money recovered by the class members, rather than guaranteeing huge fees regardless of the outcome. The goal was to make these large-scale suits less attractive or potentially excessive from the business perspective.
But the business response isn't only about fighting lawsuits or lobbying for legal changes, right? There are proactive things companies do too.
Absolutely, and this is crucial for building trust, especially with ethically minded consumers like Gen Z. Our sources highlight 4 positive, proactive responses. First, implementing rigorous quality management systems like Six Sigma or Total Quality Management to design safety and quality in from the start and prevent defects.
Makes sense. Prevent the problem.
Second, developing voluntary industry codes of conduct. These can set higher standards for safety, advertising, or ethical practices than the law might strictly require. Third, establishing dedicated consumer affairs departments. These act as an internal advocate for the consumer, handling complaints efficiently, providing information, and feeding customer concerns back into the company.
And the fourth.
And fourth, and very visibly, conducting voluntary product recalls. When a company identifies a potential safety issue, proactively recalling the product, even before regulators force them to, shows a strong commitment to that right to safety and helps maintain public trust, even though it's costly up front.
Okay, so we've established this picture of the consumer, especially Gen Z, as this increasingly empowered, digitally savvy, ethically demanding external stakeholder. But now we need to pivot. We need to look inside the organization at the internal stakeholder, the employee, and our sources paint a starkly contrasting picture here, don't they?
They really do. While consumers seem to be gaining leverage, the story for employees over the last several decades, according to this research, is largely one of losing ground, losing stability, losing power. It creates this huge internal ethical disconnect. Hashtag 3.1 major employment trends shaping the modern workforce.
So what are the major trends driving this? The sources identify several long-term shifts in the employment landscape.
Right. The first really big one is the sector shift, a massive long-term move away from manufacturing, goods-producing jobs towards service sector employment.
And that has financial consequences.
Significant ones. The data cited shows that between 1970 and 2006, while overall non-farm payrolls in the U.S. almost doubled, manufacturing employment basically stayed flat. Service employment, though, nearly tripled, and the pay difference is key. Back in 2003, for instance, the average goods-producing job paid considerably more, something like $54,000 versus $45,000 for service jobs. That structural shift contributes to wage stagnation for many and greater overall insecurity.
Okay, sector shift is one. What's another major trend?
The second is the immense pressure on work-family balance.
We hear about this all the time.
And the data shows why. The structure of families changed dramatically. The source notes that in 1969, only about 13% of couples with young kids had both parents working full-time. By 1998, that figure jumped to 31%.
That's a huge increase. And longer hours overall.
Much longer combined hours, yeah.
Yeah.
From around 52 hours a week combined to over 68. And this pressure cooker situation has only intensified, particularly highlighted during the pandemic. Remember the Great Resignation. Around 2 million people, mostly women in caregiving roles, left the workforce. The stress of juggling demanding jobs and family needs is arguably at an all-time high.
Okay, sector shift, work-family stress. What's third? Something about inequality.
Yes, third and directly linked to these other shifts, increased income inequality. And the sources stress, this isn't just a political talking point. It's a stark economic reality rooted in how the labor market values education differently now. The divergence is stunning. If you track real wage growth from, say, 1973 to 2022, people with less than a high school diploma actually saw their real wages fall for much of that period before a slight recent uptick. High school graduates, almost zero real wage growth over 50 years.
50 years.
Basically flat. But if you had a college degree, and especially an advanced degree, your real hourly wages soared. The gap just widened exponentially.
And the impact of that.
It means for huge segments of the workforce, things like affording housing, quality education for their kids, upward mobility,
Yeah.
it all becomes drastically harder. It fuels social instability and makes people much more dependent on whatever job they can get, however precarious.
Which brings us to the fourth major trend, the structural erosion of stability and benefits.
This is where companies' push for flexibility really hit home for employees. We saw the dramatic rise of the contingent workforce. Temporary workers went from being a tiny fraction, maybe 0.3% in 1973, to nearly 7% by 2017.
So less job security. What about benefits like health insurance?
Declined too. Workforce health insurance coverage dropped significantly, from around 69% in 1979 down to about 55% by 2019. But the really seismic shift, according to the sources, was in pensions. Retirement security fundamentally changed.
How did pensions change?
In 1979, nearly all private sector pension plans were defined benefit plans. That means the company promised you a specific, predictable income in retirement based on your salary in years of service. The company bore the financial risk.
Okay, that sounds secure.
It was. But by 2006, fewer than 16% of private sector workers were covered by defined benefit plans. They'd been almost entirely replaced by defined contribution plans like 401k.
Where the employee contributes and the final amount depends on investment returns.
Exactly. The company might contribute a match, but the entire risk of saving enough and managing the investments shifted from the corporation onto the individual employee's shoulders. It's a massive transfer of financial vulnerability.
Okay, so you paint this picture. Sector shifts to lower pay, massive work-life stress, exploding inequality, and the collapse of traditional job security and benefits. It feels like a perfect storm eroding the employee's position.
That accumulation of vulnerability leads directly to what our sources frame as the central ethical failure in the modern employment relationship: the widespread loss of employee voice.
Define voice in this context.
Voice is simply the ability employees have or lack to actually raise concerns, express opinions, and genuinely negotiate the terms of their employment. Things like wages, working conditions, benefits, safety protocols. It has both an individual component, can you speak up without fear, and a collective one, can workers bargain together.
And what drove this loss of voice, this weakening of negotiating power?
The sources point to three interconnected causes. Number one is globalization. When companies can easily source labor or move production across borders.
It creates a power imbalance.
A huge one. It becomes incredibly difficult for workers in one country to coordinate bargaining efforts with workers elsewhere. And the mere threat of moving jobs to a place with lower wages or weaker regulations acts as this powerful, often unspoken constraint on employee demands during any negotiation.
And governments play a role.
They do. Competition between countries to attract investment capital can sometimes lead political leaders to deliberately weaken worker protections or environmental standards, a sort of race to the bottom, which further undermines employee leverage globally.
Okay, globalization is one cause. What's the second?
The second is the deliberate corporate push for employer flexibility. This often translates into preferring short-term transactional relationships with workers rather than investing in long-term loyalty and stability. Think downsizing, outsourcing, relying heavily on contingent or gig workers.
It makes the workforce more disposable.
In effect, yes. And it shifts the burden entirely onto the worker. Suddenly, you are responsible for managing your own career path, finding your own training, dealing with income volatility and job insecurity. The company sheds that long-term responsibility.
And the third cause for the loss of voice?
Policy and institutional changes. Put simply, public policy in many developed nations like the U.S. or Australia mentioned in the sources failed to adapt to these global and corporate shifts to protect workers' ability to organize and bargain.
Failed to adapt, or was it sometimes intentional?
The sources suggest sometimes it was intentional policies were enacted or existing protections weren't enforced in ways that actively strengthened the employer's hand relative to labor. Things like making it harder to form or sustain independent unions.
So the combined effect of globalization, the push for flexibility, and policy changes, what's the result for the average worker?
The result, according to this analysis, is that most non-unionized employees today find themselves governed by what are essentially contracts of adhesion.
That term again sounds very one-sided.
It means take it or leave it. The terms of employment, wages, hours, conditions, arbitration clauses are set unilaterally by the party with the overwhelming power, which is usually the employer. The individual employee typically has no real ability to negotiate or alter those basic terms unless they happen to possess incredibly rare, in-demand skills or have the protection of a collective bargaining agreement.
Find the ethical problem with that.
The ethical problem, the sources argue, is that this isn't a fair exchange. The employer dictates terms using their superior economic power, essentially free riding on the employee's contribution and vulnerability, without allowing the employee a meaningful voice in setting the rules of the relationship. Hashtag 3.3, the stakeholder duty and failure of voluntary action.
This brings us right back to the idea of ethical duties. If employees are contributing their skills, their time, their experience, aren't they more than just costs? Aren't they stakeholders with legitimate claims on the firm?
Absolutely. That's a central argument here. Employees aren't just resources. They are moral claimants. They invest human capital, their skills, their knowledge, their effort, often significant emotional dependence. They literally are the firm in many ways.
So the firm owes them something in return.
Morally, yes, because the organization accepts the benefits of their contribution, and because employees are vulnerable and dependent on the organization, this creates an ethical obligation. The philosophers cited call it a perfect duty.
A perfect duty, meaning what?
Meaning it's obligatory, not optional. It's a duty to protect employees from harm and ensure they receive fair benefits in exchange for their contribution. It's not just a nice to do, it's a fundamental moral requirement based on the relationship itself.
Okay, if the duty is perfect and obligatory, why, as we've just discussed, does it seem to be breached so often? Why the loss of voice, the precariousness?
Simple answer: the power imbalance. When employees lack sufficient power, lack that voice, the organization, driven by other pressures, like maximizing shareholder return, can essentially dictate the terms and often fails to fulfill those perfect duties.
Which leads to a crucial question. Can voluntary corporate actions fix this? Things like corporate social responsibility, CSR reports, ESG initiatives, internal social auditing. Are they enough to ensure employers meet these duties?
This is a major point of contention in the sources. The argument presented is pretty skeptical about relying solely on voluntary measures.
Why? Don't things like B Corp certification?
They pioneered social auditing. But the key point the source makes is that their auditing process was entirely controlled by management. And crucially, when the company ran into financial difficulties, the social reporting just stopped. For 8 years.
So ethics became secondary when profits were squeezed.
That's the takeaway. It demonstrates that even in a company founded on ethical principles, voluntary social activities can become expendable when they conflict with core financial performance metrics. They remain secondary, not primary.
And does that criticism apply even to modern ESG frameworks, which often have external raters?
The criticism extends there too. The concern is that even externally rated ESG or social audits often risk becoming sophisticated reputation management tools rather than mechanisms for genuine accountability to the stakeholders themselves.
How so?
They can suffer from internal capture, where management still heavily influences the scope and reporting. And external verifiers often assess the quality of the management systems for dealing with social issues, not necessarily the actual performance or the fairness experienced by employees on the ground. Is the company truly empowering workers, or just ticking the boxes on an audit checklist?
So the argument is that as long as these initiatives are ultimately controlled by management and participation is voluntary, there's an inherent conflict. They can't reliably protect the employee's fundamental right to voice and fair treatment.
That's the strong conclusion drawn in this material. Voluntary action is seen as insufficient to counteract the fundamental power imbalance and ensure that employers consistently fulfill their perfect moral duties to employees.
Which leads where, if voluntary action isn't enough?
It leads to the argument that genuine protection requires changes in public policy and strengthening collective action. Specifically, the source argues that robust unions are essential.
Why unions specifically?
Because in this view, they provide workers with the only real legally protected right to organize independently and bargain collectively. That collective power is seen as the necessary counterweight to the employer's economic power, the only way to prevent that free riding and ensure those perfect moral duties are actually met in practice, not just in reports.
Okay, we've got this complex picture. The external stakeholder, Gen Z, demanding truth, ethics, personalization. The internal stakeholder, the employee facing eroded stability and a critical loss of voice, with voluntary measures deemed insufficient. This puts incredible pressure on leadership. So, part 4.
Yeah.
What kind of leadership can actually navigate this incredibly complex, demanding, ethically fraught reality?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the sources argue pretty strongly that traditional leadership models are fundamentally ill-equipped for this challenge. They suffer from some deep philosophical problems. #hack 4.1 problems with standard leadership models.
What are these problems? Where do standard models fall short?
The first major issue is the problem of ethics itself. Standard business school leadership models often focus almost entirely on effectiveness. Did the leader achieve the goal?
And what's wrong with effectiveness?
Nothing, if you also consider the how. But if effectiveness is the only metric, you risk ending up with what the sources call amoral leadership. Leaders who achieve results, but maybe through manipulation, coercion, or by ignoring the ethical consequences of their actions.
So the ends justify the means thinking.
Exactly. Or even well-intentioned values-based leadership can fall short if it just focuses on shared values without critically examining which values. The source grimly points out even someone like Hitler had followers motivated by shared values. Ethics has to be central to how group purposes are accomplished, respecting autonomy and freedom. It requires humility, not just conviction.
Okay, so a flawed approach to ethics is one problem. What's the second?
The second is the problem of authority. This is really interesting. The sources argue that the traditional leader-follower relationship is inherently rigged.
Rigged, how so?
Because of the power dynamics built into organizations. Think about the classic Milgram experiments on obedience, or the Stanford Prison experiment. They demonstrate that the authority vested in a position creates this powerful default switch in people, set to obey.
People do what the boss tells them just because they're the boss.
Largely, yes. And most leaders, the argument goes, fail to recognize this. They might attribute compliance to their own brilliance or persuasive ability, when often it's just people responding to the authority of the role itself. We saw this horrifically in cases like Miniscribe.
Where employees were literally packing bricks into computer boxes.
Yes, under immense pressure from leadership demanding they meet impossible sales targets. People obeyed the authority figure, even when asked to do something clearly wrong. True leadership, the source suggests, should strive to be leader by choice, where followers have the knowledge, the autonomy, and the genuine option to choose to follow, not just comply out of obligation or fear.
Right, so problems with ethics, problems with understanding authority. What's the third foundational issue with standard leadership thinking?
The third is the problem of complexity, specifically how leaders often oversimplify human motivation. The source uses this great jackass analogy from Harry Levinson.
The jackass analogy.
Yeah. It refers to the common business default, often implicit, called Theory 1, incentives drive behavior. This is the old carrot and stick model. Humans are seen as purely rational actors, primarily motivated by money, the carrot, or fear of punishment, the stick.
Like trying to move a stubborn donkey.
Exactly. Levinson argued this treats people like jackasses, simplifies their complex motivations down to just reward and punishment. It fundamentally misunderstands human nature.
So what's the alternative for an ethical leader?
Ethical leadership demands adopting Theory V, values drive behavior.
Values, not just incentives.
Right. Theory V recognizes that humans are complex, emotional, social, and moral beings. We're motivated by purpose, by principles, by belonging, by making a difference. In this model, incentives aren't the primary driver. They're just consistent consequences. They support the value system, but they don't replace it. Shifting from Theory I to Theory V requires a leader to adopt a fundamentally different and arguably more respectful and ethical view of the people they lead. Hashtag 4.2 core principles of ethical leadership.
Okay, so if we reject those flawed models, what does effective ethical leadership look like? What are the core principles guiding it in this stakeholder-driven world?
The underlying idea is that ethical leadership isn't a separate category. It's inherent in the act of leading itself. It requires moral judgment and, crucially, humility. The sources distill this into 6 core principles.
Well, let's hear them.
First, the leader principle. The leader must see themselves primarily as a member of the stakeholder group, not above it. Their role is to act for the long-term benefit of all key stakeholders, not just maximizing returns for owners or padding their own resume.
Okay, servant leadership echoes there. What's second?
Second, the constituents principle. People aren't just followers or subordinates. They are respected as vital stakeholders. Their autonomy, their voice, their well-being must be actively considered and protected to maintain a genuinely moral community within the organization. They're partners, not pawns.
Third?
Third, the outcome principle. The leader's job is to embody the organization's purpose and values. They need to constantly articulate and demonstrate how the company's basic value proposition, why it exists, what it does connects to stakeholder support on one hand and broader societal legitimacy on the other.
So linking the what and why to the who and how.
Exactly. Then fourth, the process skills principle. This is about how you lead. It mandates creating an open, two-way conversation. Leaders need the skills to listen charitably, understand different viewpoints, and engage in ethical debate respectfully.
And fifth, related to that.
Fifth is the situation context principle, which emphasizes using moral imagination. Leaders need to be creative in solving ethical dilemmas, finding ways to meet competing stakeholder needs, and navigating complex, ambiguous situations without resorting to simplistic trade-offs.
And the foundation holding it all together.
That's the sixth, the ethics principle itself. This means consciously framing actions and decisions in ethical terms, recognizing the rights involved, considering the consequences for everyone affected, thinking about the impact on character, both individual and organizational, and ultimately taking personal responsibility for the ethical implications of leadership choices. No hiding behind bureaucracy or blaming others. Hashtag tag 4.3, essential tasks of ethical leadership in practice.
Okay, those principles provide a strong philosophical framework. But let's get practical. What does an ethical leader actually do day to day? How do they merge doing the right thing with doing the right thing for the business in this complex environment?
The sources outline several essential tasks. The first is absolutely crucial. Embody purpose and values. It's not enough to talk about ethics. Leaders must live it.
Walk the talk.
Exactly. They need to tell a compelling, morally rich story about the company's purpose and values, and then consistently act as ethical role models. The example given is Citigroup's CEO, Chuck Prince, after those major scandals in Japan back in 2004. He didn't just delegate. He publicly accepted responsibility and apologized. That sent a powerful signal about accountability starting at the very top. Okay, embody values. What's next? Second, focus on organizational success, not personal ego. Ethical leaders understand that sustainable success comes from valuing the people who create the value. It's not all about them.
Any examples of that?
The source mentions Roger Enrico, former CEO of PepsiCo. In 1998, he famously gave up his $1 million salary and asked the company to put that money into a scholarship fund for the children of frontline employees instead. That kind of action powerfully demonstrates that the leader prioritizes the collective good and employee loyalty over personal enrichment.
That's a strong statement. Third task.
Third, and vital for engaging both employees and savvy consumers like Gen Z. Create a conversation about ethics that is alive. This has to go way beyond annual compliance training or a dusty code of conduct booklet.
How do you make it alive?
By making ethical considerations and stakeholders impact a routine part of discussions at all levels. Strategy meetings, operational reviews, product development. Ethical questions should be normal, expected. The classic example is Johnson & Johnson during the Tylenol crisis in the 80s.
The cyanide poisoning.
Right. Their swift, decisive action to pull all Tylenol off the shelves nationwide, despite the immense cost, was possible because their company credo wasn't just a plaque on the wall. It was a document they actively debated and discussed regularly. That living conversation about their responsibility to customers first made the incredibly tough ethical call much clearer when crisis hit.
So, embedding ethics into the culture. Fourth task. This relates back to the authority problem, right?
Exactly. Fourth task. Create mechanisms of dissent. This is non-negotiable if you want to avoid the obedience trap. Leaders must build formal, safe ways for people to push back, question decisions, and raise concerns without fear of reprisal.
And this needs to be more than just an anonymous hotline.
Way more. It needs active mechanisms. The sources suggest things like regular skip-level meetings where senior leaders meet directly with employees several layers below them, bypassing middle management. Or structured processes like General Electric's old workout sessions, which explicitly empowered frontline employees to challenge bureaucracy and propose solutions directly to management. Without institutionalized dissent, you create echo chambers where bad decisions fester.
Okay. Fifth task. Something about imagination.
Yes. Fifth, make tough calls while being imaginative. Ethical leadership isn't about seeing ethics and business success as a zero-sum game or a constant trade-off. It's about using moral imagination to find innovative solutions that achieve both.
Can you give an example of that kind of imagination?
Muhammad Yunus founding the Grameen Bank is a prime example. Traditional banking said, no collateral, no loan. Yunus used moral imagination to flip that entirely, building a successful model based on trust and social networks to lend to the poorest women. Another example cited is a chemical company chairman who demanded his engineers meet incredibly stringent environmental standards that seemed impossible.
And they did it.
They did. Pushed by the ethical demand, they innovated, found new processes, and not only met the standards, but actually ended up saving the company money. Ethical challenges can drive beneficial innovation.
That's powerful. Okay, the final overarching task. It sounds like it ties everything together.
It does. The final task is to connect the company's value proposition to societal legitimacy by actively managing for stakeholders, MFS.
Managing for stakeholders. That sounds like the core idea.
It is. And MFS, as presented here, is not about constantly making trade-offs between different groups, give a little to employees, take a little from customers. Instead, it's about using innovation and collaboration to find ways to make all key stakeholders, customers, employees, suppliers, communities, and financiers better off simultaneously over time.
Can that really work in practice?
The source gives the example of former Walmart CEO Lee Scott trying to get approval for a controversial store in Chicago. Instead of just pushing through, he engaged deeply with local community leaders, listened to their concerns, and made concrete commitments to hire locally and address their issues. By managing for the community stakeholder, he achieved the business goal and earned societal legitimacy. That synthesis, creating shared value, is presented as the core purpose and the path to sustainable success in this new era. #tag outro. So if we pull all these threads together, what's the big picture? You have the external stakeholder, the consumer, especially this true gen, demanding radical transparency, authentic ethical alignment, personalization, and fundamentally changing the nature of consumption towards access.
While internally,
the employee, the crucial internal stakeholder, is owed these fundamental ethical duties, particularly the restoration of voice and genuine power, because the evidence suggests voluntary corporate actions alone haven't been, and likely won't be, enough to correct these deep-seated power imbalances that lead to instability and unfairness.
So the leadership challenge is immense.
It really is. This environment demands a leader who truly grasps those profound problems of ethics, authority, and human complexity that we talked about. The old playbook focusing solely on shareholder value, relying on simplistic carrot-and-stick motivation, seeing ethics as separate from strategy. It's not just ethically questionable anymore. It's rapidly becoming a recipe for market failure when faced with informed, interconnected, and ethically demanding stakeholders.
So managing for stakeholders isn't just CSR fluff.
Not at all. It's presented as the core strategic imperative. It's about finding ways to create value for all the groups essential to the company's long-term survival and success. That's how you merge short-term actions with long-term legitimacy and prosperity.
Which brings us to our final thought for you, the learner, to maybe chew on. Think about this connection. We know companies need to be incredibly agile and innovative to satisfy the demands of the true gen consumer, right?
Right. They need new ideas, quick adaptation.
So could it be that the seemingly radical idea of mandating greater employee participation, giving workers that genuine voice and collective power back, maybe through policies supporting unions or work councils, as the sources suggest, could that actually be the unexpected catalyst? The disruptive force that unlocks the very innovation and agility businesses need to thrive in this new consumer landscape.
It's a provocative linkage.
It suggests that fulfilling those fundamental ethical duties internally to employees might not be a cost center, but actually the key driver of the market success required externally. Maybe the internal moral contract and the external commercial contract are really just two sides of the same coin.
A fascinating thought. The health of the internal relationships might be the prerequisite for success in the external marketplace. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the very complex, changing world of business ethics, stakeholder demands, and leadership.
We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.